One of the ways that groups remain in the pit for so long is by having leaders that encourage them to cling on to counterproductive cultures, with a major part of culture being the collective habits of a group, right? The things that a group has learned to do automatically, the way that the group handles situations, the way that the group responds to various circumstances and so forth, right? And so some groups, they have cultures that keep them in the pit, while other groups, they have cultures that allow them to advance. And so one of the obstacles of being in a lagging group is that oftentimes leaders rise from within that group and they perpetuate a narrative that keeps people in the pit, right? And it prevents them from progressing. And so to learn more about this, we're going to keep reading in the book Wealth, Poverty, and Politics by Dr. Thomas Sowell.
Hostility to more productive minorities who both increase the national standard of living and provide cultural examples and opportunities for members of the majority population to acquire the human capital of a more advanced culture in order to become more productive and advance themselves might seem to be irrational.
He's saying that it would appear that it would not make sense for a people to be hostile towards other people who have an advanced culture and that increase the standards of living for everyone, and they also provide examples and opportunities for the lagging group to advance themselves, right? That doesn't make sense to be hostile towards those types of people.
But it is quite rational, from the standpoint of the self-interest of leaders of lagging groups, to keep the groups they lead resentful of more advanced groups, and to blame those advanced groups for their own group's failure to share more fully in the economic benefits created by skills and knowledge that are not as prevalent in the lagging group's own culture.
But it makes a whole lot of sense for the leaders of the people in the pit because they have their own self-interest in mind. And so it makes sense for those leaders to keep that group resentful and hostile towards the other group, because this type of conflict is what keeps them in their leadership positions. And so they exploit the attitudes and the beliefs of the lagging group by feeding them the message that the group wants to hear, right? Not the message that they need to hear, but the message that they know that the group wants to hear, right? And so, for example, there's no shortage of these type of leaders in the black community who leech off of the plight of black people, and they perpetuate the narrative of being continuously hopeless, struggling, blaming others, and being a victim, right? And that community, they love to hear that message, right? And the leaders, they love to tell it because that's what they get paid to do.
Looked at differently, to the extent that individual members of lagging groups acquire the skills and cultures of more advanced groups, they may be absorbed into these groups or, at minimum, feel less need of their own group leaders.
And that's what those leaders fear, not being needed anymore. And that would come as a result of people developing new skills, taking more responsibility, and changing the way they interpret the events that happen in their lives, right? And so at that point, there's less of a need to have leaders who push the narrative of blaming others.
However economically beneficial various aspects of the culture of more advanced groups might be to the lagging group as a whole, the absorption of that culture is a clear threat to group leaders, who see the erosion of the indigenous culture as the erosion of their own role as leaders and the piecemeal loss of their constituency.
They're more worried about themselves, not what's in the best interest of the people.
Indeed, fear of cultural erosion and ultimately cultural extinction has been expressed by the leaders and the intelligentsia of many lagging groups at various times and places around the world.
And now Dr. Thomas Sowell is going to provide some examples on how this has applied to keeping certain languages alive.
An 18th century Czech scholar, for example, expressed fears that the increased use of the German language among fellow Czechs meant that the next generation will already be German, and in 50 years, more German than Czech will be spoken in the cities of Bohemia. Nor were such fears groundless. As a later historian said of that era, Czech speakers preponderated in Prague only among the lower classes, and though the Czech language as such was by no means close to death, it had retreated to the fields, the stables, and the kitchens, where it was spoken by servants and subordinates, and was at this point in history a badge not of nationality but of ignorance. Most servants in Prague during this era were Czech, except for an occasional German nurse or governess. Most German households had servants, and most Czech households did not. Halfway around the world, in 20th century Sri Lanka, with its Sinhalese Buddhist majority speaking Sinhala and its Tamil Hindu minority speaking the Tamil language, the same fear was expressed that the more successful minority would culturally absorb the less successful majority over time. Sinhala language activists in 1956 warned Buddhist priests that if they didn't do something, there would be no more Buddhism and no more Sinhalese. It was much the same story in Canada's province of Quebec in the 1970s, where the French-speaking majority severely restricted by law the use of English in many institutions, including private businesses. The chief architect of this policy, Cultural Development Minister Camille Loring, declared that French must become the common language of all Quebecers. As elsewhere, this was because of a need for French-speaking Quebecers to concern themselves constantly with their cultural survival and their own inferior economic and political position in Canada. Similar fears of cultural extinction for similar reasons have been expressed in Fiji, Pakistan, Malaysia, the Philippines, and Burma. These group leaders and intelligentsia have been trying to stave off the assimilation and absorption of fellow group members into economically more advanced groups.
It was the group leaders who were pushing these ideas because they didn't want the lagging members to become absorbed into the more advanced groups. Because if all the lagging group members are all gone, then so goes the job of those particular leaders. Now, does this mean that every leader of every lagging group has just their own self-interest in mind? No. Some of these people, they really believe what it is that they're doing is right in the eyes of the Lord. But a whole bunch of them, they surely do have their own interest in mind, right? At least their own interest ahead of that of the group's interest.
Today in America, Black youngsters seeking to speak the standard English of the larger society, often as part of a more general absorption of educational and other components of the larger culture, have been accused of acting white.
Because in the mind of most Black Americans, they see certain behaviors as belonging to white Americans. And Black and white, they're opposites, right? And so whatever the whites do, Blacks unconsciously feel like they're not supposed to do those things, right? And so many of those things, they pertain to things that allow people to be successful, right? Such as being on time, being professional, right? Eating healthy, being organized, and speaking standard English, right? And so if a person who's in the Black community, they speak standard English, then they say that that person is acting white.
A charge that can bring anything from ridicule to ostracism to harassment or outright violence from fellow Blacks.
Which is why people who want to get out of the pit where Black culture sits on the throne have to get away from identifying as Black and participating in much of the Black culture, right? And then let those people who want to keep identifying as Black and who want to hold firm onto the Black culture and the counterproductive parts that it promotes in society, you have to let those people be the Black people, right? Let them be Black, right? And the thing is that those types of people, they don't accept people in their circle who don't act or who don't think in a certain way. And so why would you want to be a part of a group who doesn't want you in there, right? And so let those people be Black, right? And then don't be afraid to move on and keep it pushing.
Internal attempts to prolong the longevity of a lagging group's cultural features have often been aided and abetted by outsiders who romanticize the exotic and seek to artificially preserve lagging cultures, as if cultures were museum pieces, rather than ways of dealing with the practical challenges of life.
We talked about this before in another video on how some white liberals promote Black culture and they fight to preserve it as if it's some type of ancient artifact. But like the good doctor said, culture is a way of dealing with the challenges of life, right? And it's like a group's game plan in the game of life, right? And it's just like plays in sports, right? How they can be modified to increase the chances of winning, so can culture, right? But it just depends on what the group desires to win.
Even a culture that may once have been well adapted to the particular circumstances of an earlier time can become an impediment to progress under fundamentally changed conditions.
Look, at one time, the sword was the best way to engage in war. Now, you can imagine a group today coming out using a sword or a bow and arrow to try to defend themselves against someone like the United States of America. Now, how would that work out? Not good, because the times and the conditions, they've changed. So if a group stayed adamant or they stayed firm about sticking to the use of a sword for whatever reason, then that would be an impediment, right? Although at an earlier time in history, it was the most advanced tool for that particular purpose.
This can be especially so in the case of indigenous peoples historically displaced by an invading population that has taken over much of the land and resources that made their previous environment economically viable.
If people had a culture that worked well for them in their environment, and then invaders came in and stole the land and the resources, like what happened in the Americas.
After that supporting environment has been irretrievably lost, preserving a culture adapted to that lost environment can be a serious disservice, whether among Maoris in New Zealand or among the indigenous people living on Indian reservations in the United States, or among other displaced indigenous peoples around the world.
After the invaders changed the environment into something other than what it was before, then the culture that worked best for those people in the previous environment may work against them in this new environment, right? And so this is also applicable to the ancestors who were slaves, right? The culture that they developed, it worked for them in that slave environment, right? But it worked against them and their descendants in the free environment. Understand?
In short, in many times and places, there have been many obstacles to cultural receptivity among lagging groups. The enthusiastic embrace of aspects of a different culture by 18th century Scots and 19th century Japanese was a rare exception.
The Scots and the Japanese, they both found themselves in the pit. And after they looked around to the left and then to the right, and they realized where they were, they happily embraced the cultures of the more advanced people, right? Which is a rare thing because most people in the pit, they typically point the finger at everybody else, right? But the Scots and the Japanese, they pointed the fingers at themselves, right? Which helped them realize that it was them that could take the necessary steps to make the changes that they needed to get out of the pit.
So too was the spectacular rise of Scotland and Japan to the forefront of world achievements in a remarkably short time, as history is measured.
And because they had leaders that encouraged their people to do the rare and the difficult things, they were also able to achieve the rare and exceptional results of rising out of the pit, rung by rung, and entering into the free world, where life is much better and it makes more sense. And so I want to thank you for watching all the way into the end. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.